I guess I have this idea that you're sort of playing SimCity with the ocean. You know, you're mapping things out, but because the ocean is so dynamic and currents change and things change, like the fish aren't always going to be in the same place, how do you deal with because land is so static compared to the ocean. So how do you deal with that and still have sort of a firm sort of plan?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and it's something everybody's struggling with. In fact, in Australia, you know, where the Great Barrier Reef is, they've done a lot of planning. It's not really marine spatial planning. It's a different kind of planning. But I heard a talk once by one of them, and they said when they started out, they decided that everything would be fluid. So the boundary of this area is the edge of the blah blah current, and the boundary would move when the current moved. And they quickly realized that there's no way that's going to work. No one, even though you could program it into your GPS and you could have a whole system that was just way too complicated, people couldn't deal with it. So they did go back to fixed boundaries, and we would pretty much have to do that. In terms of things moving, yes, but within large areas, I mean, we do, because a lot of ocean features are linked to bottom topography, and there are definite, you know that this coral reef has certain kinds of characteristics, or that this area with the soft bottom tends to have these kinds of fish in it. And this area, I mean, the fishermen, they pretty much know where they're going and where certain kinds of fish are. Certainly some of the migration routes of the big mammals are fairly consistent with a lot of fluctuation. I think there's no easy answer, especially with climate change, which could be really changing things, right? Now we think we know where certain kinds of fish are. They could change a lot if we had significant climate change. The ecologists that I've talked to feel that the answer to that is, one, you have to have adaptive management. So you make a picture, but it's not static forever. You need to be able to change it over time. And two, to not be too prescriptive. So we don't imagine, it would not be like in a city where you can literally see a map and every parcel is zoned. This is R3, this is, I2, exactly what can go in every parcel. There would be much larger areas, and it would be more of a zoning, what people refer to as a zoning by objective, rather than a zoning by use. So it wouldn't say, this area is for windmills, and this area is for this, and this area is for this. It would be, this area is going to be zoned sensitive ecological, making up words. So any activity that's compatible with that, maybe a guy out in a rowboat is okay in that area, but an oil well wouldn't be. This area is, we're going to allow to be more heavily built up. So it could have oil rigs, it could have wind turbines, it could have other kinds of things. This area has a very sensitive bottom, so we don't want any kind of trawling, but you could have some other kind of fishing, and you could have maybe aquaculture on the surface that wouldn't be affecting the bottom. So it would be broad zones with multiple uses categorized by objective, the objective for that area. That's about as good as we can do right now.
And a rezoning.
And adaptation, and constant, always going back and looking and seeing, is it working the way we think it is? What are the effects? Let's change it as things change. I mean, it's hard. I mean, and I've heard lots of people say, "Oh my God, that sounds like so much trouble and really hard." And how are we going to do it? But I think we have to just keep coming back to, well, what we're doing now is not working. We can't go on doing what we're doing. It's not working. Ample evidence of that. So we're going to need to do something different. What is likely to work? And then let's figure out how we can do it. And let's figure out how we can make it, use existing resources, existing data, work together. I mean, right now, one of the problems is that all those agencies that I had up there on that thing, they'll all go and do the same data gathering. We found out in that. Were you there at the academy when we did that mapping study? We did a study of coastal mapping. And it turns out that every agency that cares about the coast does the same mapping efforts. They'll go and collect the same data. Maybe there's some little extra thing. They don't talk to each other and say, well, I'm going to do some kind of survey of this area. Anybody else need that? Can I add an instrument on that'll help you? So there's a lot of room for efficiency.
It's easy to kind of focus in on the implementation questions as one of the big obstacles, and like all the federal players, I think you have to include all the federalism in there, the state players and authority there, and entrepreneurial local planners, plan authorities in different ways as well. It's really cloudy really fast. But another area that we haven't talked about, but I think it's also one of the big, as a public administration, political scientist, when I saw that list of 13, it wasn't the data that I focused on as the big gap and the hardest thing. It's that question you've got right there about what do we want to look like? Because there's no consensus about that. And there's, what's the mechanism for having that conversation in America? I'm not sure, I think it feeds back to your question, I'm not sure if I see it as, ecologists like to say, look at things in regions, and then they complain that the political structure isn't set up around the regions, and therefore the political structure is flawed. But I think the mirror image of that same question is, that question is a human question, and humans are organized around those political boundaries, and do get identity from their states, and their places, and their counties, more than they get the affiliation with their ecosystem region. So have you seen anything innovative coming out of the marine spatial planning discussion around how to do that?
Well, again, what people are sort of hanging their hats on are these regional compacts, where people are starting, and in some regions more than others, to have a regional identity. So on the West Coast Governor's Agreement, for the first time, and when did that, was that 5 years ago that they signed the West Coast Governor's Agreement, roughly? For the first time, all those West Coast states said, we have common cause here, right? The current is going up and down the coast. We can't just pay attention to our own piece. We're all affecting each other. So people are very hopeful that those regional compacts around the coast will start getting, at least the politicians, if not people, thinking in terms of their mutual interests. But how do you answer that question? I mean, it's not unlike on land. Every county, and again, there are nests, that's the other thing I meant to say in terms of the nesting. On land, that happens all the time, right? There's neighborhood zoning and city zoning and county zoning and statewide zoning. It's not always easy. You have to be in the same room. You argue. You argue it out like everything we do with politics. And ultimately, you make a decision and it gets enshrined. And people will fight against it and try to change it. And yeah,